Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the American Academy of Pediatrics and HealthyChildren.org, the official AAP website for parents. This afternoon, we'll be discussing 5 steps to raising an organized child. I have a few pieces of housekeeping before we begin. First, we want to give you a heads up that we're using a new webinar system, so please forgive us if we experience any technical difficulties. This webinar is being recorded, so if you lose connectivity for any reason, you will be able to watch and listen to the archived webinar in a week or two. Hopefully, we won't experience too many glitches. If we can help you with any technical issues during the webinar, send an email to kjuhl, KJUHL, @aap.org, or send a chat message within the webinar. If you've joined us by computer, you can activate chat by clicking on the speech bubble in the bottom center of your screen. The chat window will open in your lower right-hand corner. If you've joined us by a mobile device, tap on the person-shaped icon to chat. We'll have time at the end of the webinar for a quick question and answer session. To ask a question, please use the chat function, again activated by clicking on the speech bubble at the bottom center of your screen or on the person-shaped icon for mobile users. You can send in your questions anytime, and Dr. Korb will get to as many as he can at the end of his presentation. I would now like to introduce our host, Dr. Damon Korb. Dr. Korb is a board-certified behavioral and developmental pediatrician and the president of the Society for Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics. He is the founder and director of the Center for Developing Minds and an adjunct clinical instructor at Stanford University Medical Center. He is the father of 5 children and the author of a new book published by the American Academy of Pediatrics, Raising an Organized Child: 5 Steps to Boost Independence, Ease Frustration, and Promote Confidence. Today, Dr. Korb will present an overview of those 5 steps. We've got a lot to cover, so I'll turn the mic over to Dr. Korb.
Good morning to everyone on the West Coast. Good afternoon to everyone on the East Coast. I want to add to my credentials that I am the big brother to someone who is 15 years younger than me, so I helped raise that person as a child. I babysat as a child. I'm married to a wonderfully organized person. We have 5 kids. I've coached 20 seasons of youth sports. I'm a pediatrician. I've written this book. And I can tell you that parenting is not easy, even with all of those credentials. And my hope in writing this book is to break down some important parts of parenting into 5 easy to remember steps. And we're going to talk about those steps during this presentation today. Just trying to advance my slide. I'm going to let the panelists take over the advancing slide. It's not working on this end. Perfect. Thank you very much. So we're going to talk about the 5 steps to raising an organized child. And those 5 steps that we talk about in the book are that we need to be consistent, we introduce order, we give everything a place, we practice forward thinking, and we promote problem solving. And I'm going to describe those in more detail as we go forward. Let's advance it. So I want to first make sure people understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about an organized child. I'm not just talking about finding 2 socks that match. We're talking about the executive functions and neurodevelopmental abilities that create confident and independent kids. We're talking about how we think. We want to teach our kids to solve problems, to see the big picture, to show insight, to take perspective, to make plans. These are the skills that they're going to need as they enter into adulthood. That's what I mean by organization. Now, we're going to talk about how to help them find their socks too, but the big picture is we want them to think organized for themselves. Next slide, please. I want to tell you a quick story about my child. My kids all play a lot of sports, and one of them, when he was 5, I coached his basketball team. It was not a competitive team. We had a child who used to get on his hands and knees and bark like a dog during the game. Nobody took it serious. The league didn't keep score. Nobody kept score except for my son and his buddy Dana. And they sat on the bench and they would keep score. They would not only keep score, they would keep track of who scored. If somebody didn't score, they'd try to get them the ball so that everybody could score. And I asked him, why are you keeping score? We're just out here playing to have fun. And he said, Dad, I really like math. And what that reminded me of is that, the big picture is we're all playing sports for different reasons, but it's not about winning. It's about making the kids enjoy it. And so over the next 10, 15 years of basketball, because he played all the way for years and years, we did a lot of math and kept a lot of stats. Next slide. So organized children are not born, they're raised. And this is the philosophy in the book, in that we need to teach organizational skills to our kids. And we're going to use the 5 steps: be consistent, introduce order, give everything a place, practice forward thinking, and promote problem solving to help them develop. And we're going to talk about how these 5 steps can be applied differently, but the same 5 steps can be applied differently across the age of development. Let me just show you a couple research studies briefly that give us a sense of how these organizational skills and the brain capacity is developing as children get older. Next slide, please. So when children are infants, all the way up to teenagers, they're continuing to develop these organizational skills. That part of the brain called the frontal lobe is actually getting stronger and getting more organized and more efficient. And the more we can help them practice and train this part of the brain, the more effective and efficient this part of the brain works. Next slide. So the first experiment I want to talk to you about is a sorting task done by a researcher named David Korb. And in this sorting task, what he did is he had 2 different sets of cards that were cards of rabbits and cards of cars. And the cards were different colors. So he had blue and green rabbits and he had blue and green cars. And he would take 2-year-olds and he would say to the 2-year-old, I want you to put all of the rabbits in this pile. And 2-year-olds are able to do that. They're able to follow this one rule and put all of the rabbits in one pile. But then he would say to the 2-year-old, great, now we're going to play the color game, and I want you to put all the blue cards in this pile. And 2-year-olds would continue to put rabbits in that pile. And he would ask them what they're doing, and they would say, I'm putting the rabbits in this pile, because they couldn't follow that transition. It was too many steps for them to figure out. Now, when they did that with 3-year-olds, 3-year-olds also struggled with switching to the color game, but 3-year-olds could tell you what the rule is. I'm supposed to put the blue ones over here, but they'd keep putting the rabbits over there. Again, too much information. 4-year-olds had no difficulty making that switch. So by the time by the time a child is 4-year-old, their brain is more flexible and they're able to shift rules and do what makes sense. And that's important as we talk later about meltdowns and tantrums and things like that I know everybody wants to hear about. Next slide. Another experiment done by Mitchell, and in this experiment was the marshmallow that they put on a table, and they told the child ages 4 to 6 that I'm going to leave this marshmallow here. I'm going to go out of the room for 15 minutes. If this marshmallow is here when I get back, I'm going to give you 2 marshmallows. Now you can eat it and you can do what you want. If I come back and the marshmallow's gone, you don't get any more marshmallows. And then they walked out and watched these kids through these one-way mirrors and watched them suffer and stroke the marshmallow longingly, wishing for that marshmallow. But what they found was all of the 4-year-olds ate the marshmallow. They couldn't wait. And 5-year-olds got better, but the closer they got to 6, the later 5-year-olds and the 6-year-olds were pretty good at being able to see the big picture. Wait a second. It makes sense that I wait now and I do what's best in the long run. Before age 5 or 6, it's really hard for kids to understand the big picture and why it's important. But as early as age 6, the flip of that, as early as age 6, kids are able to use this kind of reasoning. And it's important for us to challenge that. Next slide. Thank you. So let's talk about the 5 steps to raising an organized child. The 5 steps: be consistent, introduce order, give everything a place, practice forward thinking, promote problem solving. And it's important that along this path, we don't push them too hard, but we need to push them forward. And if we don't push them forward, we're, in a sense, robbing them of the opportunity to solve problems. So for instance, if you have a 4-year-old and you're still feeding your 4-year-old by spoon instead of letting them use their own spoon, which they could probably start doing closer to age 1, you are robbing them of the opportunity to learn how to control their coordination and to feed themselves. If your child is in 5th grade and you're still packing their lunch for them, which is something they could probably do by the time they're in 2nd or 3rd grade, you're robbing them of the opportunity to make those plans and figure things out for themselves. So you want to push them at the level that's appropriate. Now, I want to emphasize one more point, that the appropriate level is different for every child. And one of the ways this book is organized is it's organized by age. And what I want people to recognize when they're reading this book is you may have a child who is 13, but they may have the executive functions or the organizational skills of a 6-year-old. And that's not too uncommon. And if we're holding them to the 13-year-old expectation, they're going to struggle every day. By looking at this book and seeing where our child, what level our child's at, it gives us a better sense of how to push our child at the appropriate level. Next slide, please. So let me give you an example of ways that we can gradually pull back. This is how you break down homework. So when kids are in kindergarten and they get packets of homework, the teacher gives them this neatly prepared packet, sends it in a folder to the home. The parents take it out, they look at it, they talk to the child, they say, why don't you do this page today, we'll do the other one tomorrow, and the parents oversee and support the homework. As kids get to be a little bit older, the teacher's supervision steps back, but parents still are involved. Parents may see that the homework's getting done, they may be checking to make sure it was done correctly and then sending it back to the teacher. And by the time a child is in 3rd grade or 4th grade, ideally the parent's role is diminished. At that point, the child comes home, does their homework, parents are around if they need anything, and when the student comes back to the teacher, ideally the teacher should communicate to the parent if there's a problem, but otherwise the teacher just checks it and monitors it, and the child has a little more independence. By the time a child's in middle school, the parent's role is really just to help with long-term planning. You've got this report due, you might want to think about, we're going out to eat on Wednesday night, it'll be hard for you to do homework, you may want to start some of it on Monday. Just thinking about the big picture, the long-term plan, because younger kids aren't great at that. As we get older, the supervision becomes even more relaxed, and parents eventually evolve to becoming a consultant, where they say, listen, I'm here in high school, I'm here if you need me, but they're not checking on their homework. Relaxed supervision is maybe they check the online portal once a week to see where their child's grades are. But ultimately, by the time they're in high school, that should be on the child, and you're there if they need you, and you want your child to learn how to ask for help. By the way, the same thing can be applied to any process. It can be applied to feeding oneself. At first, they spoon feed, and then you give them finger foods or you give them finger foods, and then they learn to spoon feed themselves. And then you can give them a cup with a lid, and then you give them a cup without lid. You gradually give them more and more freedom. Don't be afraid of the mess. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. Kids are going to make mistakes. That's how we learn. Next step. So let's talk about being consistent. This is the first step. So being consistent is important for a couple reasons. The first thing we find is that kids that are brought up in disorganized and chaotic environments where their needs are not regularly met have what's called toxic stress. And toxic stress happens when cortisol levels increase. Cortisol is your stress hormone. And when cortisol levels increase, it's damaging to the brain, especially to the frontal lobe, which is the part of the brain that's important for these executive functions, these planning functions. So when we look at kids that are brought up in orphanages where there's 3 kids to a bed and they're only picked up when their diaper is changed or when they're fed 3 or 4 times a day, it's not uncommon to see kids with frontal lobe injuries from this toxic stress. So how do you avoid that toxic stress? Well, you're consistent with your routines. When your baby cries, you pick them up. When your baby's diaper is soiled, you change the diaper. When your baby's hungry, you feed the baby. And actually, what you're doing by being consistent is not just reducing their stress, but you're teaching them a sequence that if I do this, then this happens. It's cause and effect, which is the first sequence that kids learn, and they understand it by 6 months old. They understand this. They're already learning a sequence as an infant. So it's never too early to start teaching your kids about organization. As kids get a little older, we are consistent about safety rules. Toddlers get themselves into trouble. They put things into electric sockets. They touch hot stoves. So we have very consistent boundaries. You hold my hand when we're near the street in order to be safe. We have these very consistent boundaries that are clearly enforced so that kids understand the rules and the expectations. As kids get older, we talk a lot about the expectation. You know, you need to be home by a certain time. There's no driving after dark. Whatever the rules are, the more consistent we can be, the easier it is for them to learn the rules. This becomes important around routines like bedtime. If you have regular routines around bedtime and your children go to bed at 8 o'clock, and you don't make exceptions, it's going to be much easier for them to go to bed at 8 o'clock. If once a week you have movie night and we stay up till 9 or 10, they might say, gosh, can we do a movie night tonight? And then argue with you. But if the rule is we stay consistently, it becomes much easier to support your kids. Now, I understand in life the reality is that there's exceptions. And when there's exceptions, you clearly explain them. And like we said, kids can be a little flexible once they're 5, 6 years old. You explain the rule. So tonight is New Year's Eve. It's once a year. On this night, we're going to stay up late and have ice cream sundaes. So you've clearly explained why this is an exception. And that way, kids are less likely to argue with you about the regular routines of life. Next slide, please. So the next thing we want to do is we want to introduce order. Introduce order. When we're talking about little kids, like I mentioned earlier, with infants, cause and effect is important. The natural consequences that they learn in life, whether it's cause and effect of I cry and you pick me up, or if it's cause and effect, meaning I am sneaking my phone and using it at 2 in the morning and I lose my phone because I'm not using it appropriately, that's teaching that order of cause and effect, natural consequence. That's important. From a very young age, we start introducing the concept of time to kids. So we use words like after and during and before when kids get to be 2 and 3, so they start understanding those concepts of time. We count everything. Every time we walk up the stairs, we count the stairs in our house. When we're sitting on the front porch, we count the cars that go by. Understanding order and numbers is important for kids. We develop routines so that kids understand that everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So the routines that we start when they're infants should continue throughout their lifetime, with some variation, of course. But we have a bedtime routine. We have a dinner routine. We have a getting ready for school routine, a walking out of the house routine. And if we do these things in similar ways, kids understand it. When I come home, my shoes go here, my backpack goes there. That's our coming home routine. And sometimes for kids who are having trouble learning them, you can write these steps down. And if they're really young, you can use a picture chart. And if they get older, you can write them down in words so that they can see the steps. Everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You take out the toy, you play with the toy, you put away the toy. You prepare the meal, you eat the meal, you put away the meal. That's what we do, and we need to teach them that final step so that they can learn to be closers. Closers is a concept that is real important when kids enter high school. That's the age where they really start to learn that, gosh, if I do that little extra effort, it makes a huge difference in my ability to shoot free throws or my teacher's ability to read my essay. Being able to finish and do a thorough job is something that we emphasize to our kids. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when I was a kid, I used to lose my car keys all the time when I turned 16. I used to lose them so frequently that I put a hanger under the bumper of my car, because back then when I was learning to drive, you used to be able to break into cars really easily with a hanger. So I had a hanger hidden under the bumper of my car. I'd lose my keys. I'd use the hanger to break into my car, and I'd keep a spare key, which is good planning. I'd keep a spare key under the mat, and I would drive home. And I thought I had and usually my keys would show up. I'd find them somewhere. They'd be in my classroom. They'd be in my locker. But I used to lose them all the time, and it was a great plan up until my friends realized what I was doing. And then every time at the end of school I'd come to look for my car during lunch, they would have moved it to a new parking spot. That wasn't always the best plan, but up until that point I thought I was a genius. When I got married, however, my wife put a basket by the door, and for the last 26 years tomorrow, or 2 days from now, I will have not lost my keys. I haven't lost my keys since I've been married, because my keys always go in the same place when I come home. If you give things a place, things don't get misplaced. Everything needs a place. So kids need to know where things go, and we develop this spatial system even when they're infants. Even when they're little babies, we give them mobiles that have contrast, so we start developing their visual processing system. When they're toddlers, we bop balloons and we catch handkerchiefs and we roll balls back and forth so that their brain can get trained on the mental calculus that it requires to figure out the arcs and tangents of a ball moving through space, and to time exactly when you need to get your hands in place. All of that is developing that visual processing system, which will be important when you want your kids to know where things later go. It's also important in that the visual processing system is more efficient than the sequential processing system. So we just talked about introduce order, but I want to say that giving everything place is important. So let's think about reading. When you're reading and you start learning to read, you sound out every word. But once you get to the point where you can sight word read, reading becomes much more efficient. When you're looking at somebody's face and you want to remember it, you don't remember an eye and then to the right of it another eye and then somewhere below it is a nose. No, you look at the whole gestalt. You look at the whole picture of their face, and that's how you remember it. And if you can train that system, kids become more efficient. Some kids get to high school and that system isn't very well developed, and often their rooms are a disaster. And they don't know where to start because they can't visualize where everything goes. Now, that's the exception. Most kids don't clean their room just because they don't recognize why it's important. But we want to develop that system so that they understand that they can do it when grandma's coming over and I need the house cleaned by 3 o'clock. The kids, you can watch that this system is developing, so that object permanence, that's the ability to, when you drop your fork off the edge of your high chair, to know that it still exists. Prior to like age 8 months, 9 months, if they drop their fork over the edge, kids don't look for it. But at 8, 9 months, they drop their fork over and they look for it. They no longer assume it's gone. They know it must still exist. That's why somewhere after about 10 months, kids get stranger anxiety, because they know when mom's gone, she's still there somewhere, and I need to call for her, otherwise she may not come back. So we teach these skills to kids even when they're little so that they can develop more as they get older. Next slide. Practice forward thinking. So this is where things get more complicated, and many kids before age 4 or 5 really struggle with this task, but you could start introducing it to them when they're toddlers. So we're talking about anticipating, planning, estimating, all these skills that require thinking ahead. And I want you to know that the skills that are required to think ahead happen in the same part of the brain that allow us to think in the past. So foresight and hindsight are actually very related. And if you want your kids to learn from their mistakes, they have to develop this forward and backward thinking system in their brain. So how do we practice forward thinking? Well, even when kids are 2, you talk about plans. You show them your internal thinking. So we're going to go to the beach today. What do you think we should bring? A shovel. Great. That's a shovel. Where are we going to put the sand after we shovel it? I bring my bucket too. That's good. And should we all go naked to the beach? No, let's bring our swimsuit. You talk them through the plan so that they understand what they need to be thinking ahead. And then as they get older, 3, 4, 5, they fill in many more of the blanks, and they start anticipating some of those things and thinking more on their own. So this is when we really want to, again, go back to those experiments we talked about, where we talked about the sorting task, and we talked about the marshmallow task. This is that part of the brain that's really developing when your kids are 4 and 5 and 6. And so we want to challenge that as much as possible. What are you going to need for school today? What do you want to pack for lunch? And when they start packing their own lunch at around 3rd grade, it requires some planning. It requires some planning skills to be able to, remind you that we're running out of food so that we have the right food for them to pack. It requires planning so that they're not hungry at the end of the day, and if it's a hot day, maybe they bring 2 things of water. It requires that element of planning, and you want kids to learn how to do that. Let's talk about the next slide, problem solving. So this kid's problem was he wanted to figure out how to fly and to look fly at the same time. In kids, we want them to learn how, this is the ultimate goal in our parenting. We want kids to be capable of solving problems, of figuring out what's the best thing to do in any given situation. And this requires a different kind of thinking. It requires divergent thinking, meaning what are all the possibilities here? What are all the things we can do? And I got to tell you, the best way to teach that is through imaginative and creative play. What could we make right now? What could we play right now? That imaginative and creative play. When my friends are over, what could I be doing? It's important to let your kids be bored. These days, we are defaulting to electronics so frequently that kids aren't having the opportunity to be bored. So there seems that kids aren't having the opportunity to be bored. And what happens is we deprive them of the opportunity to solve that when they're not dealing with their own boredom. What we want to do is we want to, when I was a kid, drive to Los Angeles, which was a 5-hour drive for me. And during that drive, I'd have to look outside, or I'd play the license plate game, or I'd make up songs, or we would do something. Now we give our kids an electronic, and the people who are creative with electronics are the people who are designing the electronics. The people who play it are pretty passive. And so we're missing out on opportunity. It's not so much that the electronics are bad, it's that they're missing out on the opportunity to be creative. Another problem-solving opportunity is taking perspective. Another problem-solving opportunity is taking perspective. And it's important for kids to think about perspective, to think about, what would my teacher want for this to be an A paper? What would make my friend happy? What do you think someone else would feel like if I did this? And it's important to talk about that. Again, that's a problem to solve that becomes really valuable as they get older. You know who's lousy at solving problems? 2-year-olds are lousy at solving problems. So when we think about the terrible twos, which actually are 2.5 to 3.5 years old, those kids have meltdowns and tantrums all the time because they have trouble being flexible, and because they don't have the communication skills to really describe what they're thinking. So once kids get to be 4, we showed you in the sorting experiment that they become more flexible thinkers. And this flexibility allows them to be better problem solvers. Now, if you have a 2.5-year-old or a 3-year-old that's having meltdowns, that's pretty developmentally appropriate. But if you have a 7 and 8-year-old who's still having these frequent and intense meltdowns, what you have is a child who's developmentally delayed in their ability to solve problems. And they need support in this area so that they can build those frontal lobe skills in order to solve problems. Next slide, please. So I want to point out that these rules, these principles that we're talking about, these 5 steps, can be applied to all populations. So if we're talking about kids with ADHD or autism, fetal alcohol syndrome, Down syndrome, like this little wonderful boy in the picture, the difference is sometimes you need to slow down. You need to be more consistent and more persistent and more patient so that kids understand the rules and the boundaries and the expectations. But it's the same principles that we apply to other children. It just takes longer before we get to planning and problem solving. Next slide, please. So we're wrapping up. Let me just, and after we wrap up, we'll do some questions. But let me tell you briefly about my son, just to continue the story forward. He ended up going to college at MIT, became the captain of the team for 3 years and played 4 years of basketball, and got to do a whole lot of math along the way. So you keep pushing your kids and help them be organized, and good things happen. Let me switch. Let me do the next slide. So I just want to conclude and say that teaching children how to think organized is more important of a skill than teaching organizational skills. We want to teach kids how to think organized. Next slide. So if you have more questions, you can go to our website, raisinganorganizedchild.com, or you can follow us on Twitter or on Facebook at Organized Child. It's a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
All right. Thank you for sharing this information, Dr. Korb. I'm definitely going to use some of your advice with my very disorganized 4-year-old at home. We do now have some time for questions. If you haven't already done so, please use the chat window to send your questions. Dr. Korb will try to respond to the questions in the order in which they arrive, but he may not be able to get to all the questions today. While you submit your questions, I'd just like to remind you that you're invited to register on healthychildren.org to receive our once monthly newsletter, a personalized homepage, and special offers. And don't forget to follow healthychildren.org on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. I'll turn the mic over to Dr. Korb again for your questions.
So let me start off with the question, and this is a question I get every time I talk. Any advice to parents who struggle with organization or planning? And how do they teach it to their children when they themselves have some organizational issues? So what I want parents, so first of all, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make organization, the parts of organization more simple and more clear so that it's easier for parents to support their kids. The second thing is the big picture around organization is that we want parents to recognize that organization is important. And if they can convey that to their kids, even though they're not perfect, and show that they're working on it themselves, the big picture is we're sending the message that organization is an important thing. Now, nobody that I've ever met is weak at every kind of organizational. Some people may have spatial weaknesses and things are messy, but they're really good at keeping on time. Some people are the opposite. And so use your strengths that you have in order to help promote organization. Let's see. The next question I want to answer, they're coming in so fast, I got to try to keep up, is how do I get my kids to clean their room, and is it important that I get my child to clean their room? So the answer is the most important thing around cleaning their room is they understand why it's important to clean their room. So you shouldn't have food in your room because rodents and bugs will show up if you have food in your room. That's not acceptable. If you have too much dirty clothes, things smell in the room, and it's offensive to other people. As kids get older, the really big picture is, gosh, thinking becomes more efficient when our room and our environment is neat around us. But they have to learn that for themselves. You can't just say that because it's a concept that they don't totally understand until they figure it out. And they have to know how to clean their room. So, if their room's messy, but they can clean it up by 3 o'clock when grandma's coming over, I'm a little less concerned. If they can get their clothes off the floor because they know that somebody's going to be vacuuming that afternoon, and it's important to vacuum so that soil doesn't get ground into the carpet, then that's okay. If they keep their messes contained to their room, that's maybe not the battle you want to fight. But you want them to learn how to clean their rooms. Let's see. Next question is, let's do this one. How do we know about milestones and expectations that are appropriate for our child's organization? So in the book, I talk about reasonable expectations by age. The book is divided in sections of infants and toddlers and preschool age students and school age students and teenagers. And as you read through these chapters, you can say, gosh, I have a teenager who may be brilliant and smart, but he's organizing like a school age child. And so that gives you a general sense of where your child would fall. So I would suggest using the book to really understand where your child's level is at. Next question is, I'm having trouble with my young child learning how to do things in the right order. And I've seen a number of questions asking about step wisdom. So step wisdom, again, is that concept of everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so even when my kids are very little, we start teaching this, and we do it by being consistent. So we have, when we're changing a diaper, we take off their clothes, we change the diaper, we put on the clothes, and I say what I'm doing. We're taking off your clothes, we're wiping your bottom, we're putting on your clothes. And when they take out a toy, and a lot of times it's much easier to teach these things if you don't have toys everywhere, but they take out a toy, they play with the toy, they put away the toy. It's that concept of everything has a step, a beginning, a middle, and an end that I want kids to learn how to do. Let's see, there's a question about ADHD, and I think I answered that in our slide about kids who develop differently. It just have to be more patient and take their time. How do I get my 2-year-old? Here's a good one. How do I get my 2-year-old to start helping cleaning their playroom? This is a tricky thing because it somewhat depends on temperament. And the more strong-willed temperament your child has, the more patient you as a parent need to be. And not butt heads, but just be calm and say, this is what we're doing. And if they're having trouble with getting started, you start off with having them do something called backwards chaining. And what that looks like is maybe they just do the last step. And next time they clean up, they do the last 2 steps. And then the last 3 steps. So you're participating with them. You're emphasizing that it's important that it gets done, but you're not doing it all for them. Because once you start doing that, they're going to ask for that all the time. It's much easier to have you do things than for them to have to do it themselves. Let's see. I have a question that says, there's more questions about adults that are always funny. Are there any children's books that you recommend that would help promote kids to be organized? I'm sure there are. I'm going to think about it and come back to that question. But since I'm getting your chats, if you guys have ideas, send them to me, and I'll announce them over the webinar. Next question is it too late for my college-age student to learn these skills? And the answer is it's never too late, but you have to be cognizant of where they're at developmentally. So much of being a young adult is being autonomous and independent. And if you're there telling them what to do and dictating everything, you're saying, hey, I don't have the confidence in you to do what you need to do. I don't have the confidence in your ability to survive in college, so I'm going to do things for you. So it's important to not overparent. And at the same time, my oldest child is almost 24, no longer a child, but we're still parenting. It doesn't end. And that frontal lobe, that part of the brain, the research says it keeps growing till you're somewhere between 25 and 28. So it's not too late. But the difference is we have to continue to set boundaries and expectations, meaning this is what our personal boundaries and limits are as parents. And it's not telling them what they have to do, but it's making really clear what your expectations are. And I try to teach these young adults that one of their jobs is to manage their parents' expectations. Because if my college-age child says, Mom, I'm going over to John's house, I'm going to be there really late, I'm going to come back at 2 a.m., and then she sends me a text at 1:30 saying, I'm leaving now, she's managing my expectations. She's telling me when she's going to come back. She's letting me know that everything's going okay. And if she comes home by 2 o'clock, my anxiety level goes down. And as parents, we're all somewhat anxious about the struggles, the potential struggles of our children. So it's good to give them freedom, but also help them learn that there's still a big picture out there that they need to think about. Next question, is organized thinking helpful for things they want to do better? Like if they want to learn an instrument, they will do the lessons, but they don't want to practice in between. So this falls into the concept of big picture thinking. Why am I playing this instrument? Now, some people go to music lessons because 4 of their friends are there, and it's a social opportunity, and they don't really care about how great they can be. And it's important for you as a parent to maybe in those instances reset your expectation. Maybe it's a great social opportunity, and hey, they'll get a little bit of music experience. But if your child truly wants to be good at something, then I always talk about what are the steps to be better. You know, what are the parts of your, and I use the analogy of sports a lot because I did a lot of coaching, but what are the parts of your game that you want to improve? And we talk about specific things that they can control. So if they say, I want to win more games, well, that's out of their control. They never know who they're going to play. But if they say, I want to improve my free throw percentage, well, how are you going to get better at shooting free throws? And you let them figure out what it takes to be better. Yeah, I notice every time you go to your piano lesson, the teacher seems to think that you're not prepared. Why do you think that is? What could you do about it? What could we do to see if we could get the teacher to smile or say something differently to you when you walk in the door or you start playing? You want to encourage them and give them the opportunity to solve that problem. And kids, once they get to be 6, start being able to, 5, 6, start to be able to solve problems like that. My 2-year-old is a very clear speaker. Next question. My 2-year-old is a 2.5-year-old is a very clear speaker with a large vocabulary, but as you mentioned, melts down. At what age can I expect him to be able to talk through, verbalize his frustrations? Is it a vocabulary readiness or age readiness? So that's a great question. And it sounds like for your specific child, and it's always hard for me to give advice about specific children when I get a paragraph question, but for your specific child, from what you're describing, vocabulary isn't the issue. It sounds like the bigger issue is flexibility, but for many 2.5-year-olds, vocabulary is an issue. It's just hard for them to think through problems. And being able to verbally think through problems is a big advantage. If you think about, for example, the kids that are in juvenile detention centers, something like 90% of them have either ADHD or a language processing disorder. So they don't sit and think through what would be the best time for me to still the TV. Should I do it in broad daylight? Should I make sure the cameras are turned off? They don't have those verbal skills, and so as a result, they get caught. The kids with great verbal skills are less likely to get caught. But for your child, it probably has more to do with being flexible. And as we talked about with the card sorting task, many 4-year-olds aren't that good at being flexible. They're not that good at taking perspective. So hopefully, in a typically developing situation, somewhere around 3.5 to 4, when that kicks in, you'll see that improve. At the current time, your job is to just be really clear with the rules, to not punish your child for having meltdowns, but just showing that that's unacceptable and taking them and moving them away from the situation so that it doesn't affect everybody else. And to teach your child the ability to comfort and soothe themselves. And you do that by, when they're calm, doing different relaxation activities and maybe reverting to those relaxation activities, such as singing a nice song or jumping on the trampoline or getting swaddled in blankets, whatever kind of works for them, so they learn the skills of being able to soothe themselves. Let me see, looking up for more questions. Got to scroll real quickly. There's a question that says, what's your recommendation if your spouse and you aren't on the same page? As in, I'm far more organized than my spouse. So we got to be careful what it means to be not on the same page. I think if you are not on the same page as your spouse, there's bigger problems than your 2-year-old. But if what you're, I think, implying in this question is, if your child, one of you, the parents, doesn't have the same skill set as the other parent, it's important for the parents to agree on at least what's important, that it's a valued system, and you guys rely on each other's strengths when you parent, and you don't do it in a condescending way to the other parent, but the parent that's weaker could say, listen, we got to check in with your mom to make sure that there's time on the schedule, because I can't really remember the schedule. And that's okay. But you work together as long as you share the same values. Next question. Any suggestion for a strong-willed 4-year-old? We do have consistent bedtime and daily routines as working parents, but have constant struggles with him getting him to comply with our plans. So again, not knowing your individual child, it's tricky, but here's something that works for a lot of families, and we try to make things very reward-based. So for instance, in my family, we would say bedtime's at 8 o'clock. If you get ready for bed, teeth brushed, and get your pajamas on, we will read stories with you until 8 o'clock. If you get that done by 7:55, you get 5 minutes of stories. But if you get that done at 6:30, I'm going to sit there for an hour and a half and read stories with you. So we're trying to build in incentives that are valuable to them, and then you give them the opportunity to succeed or crash. And sometimes, this backfires on some days where they really wanted to read, but they don't get ready till 8:02, and there you have to be real consistent. You say, gosh, shoot, I really would love to have read a story tonight. I wanted it too, so I feel kind of badly. But we'll have to do it tomorrow because bedtime's at 8 o'clock. And you're consistent. You can't be afraid of meltdowns. If your child has a meltdown in the grocery store, they've seen meltdowns before. You wheel your cart up to the front desk and you say, can you put this in the fridge? I'll come back in a half hour and pick it up. And then you take your child out to the car, let the meltdown end, and you go back in. It's not the worst thing in the world to have a meltdown. And some kids, it takes them time to, again, learn the language skills, learn the flexibility, and to develop the impulse control in order to control their emotions. So this is related to the next question. What is your advice for dealing with toddlers in the middle of a meltdown, considering they often have the emotional regulation, considering they often don't have the emotional regulation or language to talk through it? So I like to tell this story. My wife one day was in, I think, a sporting goods store with our 5 little ducklings, and one of them started having a tantrum. Well, on that same day, the developmental specialist from my office was in the sporting goods store as well, and she heard this kid screaming, and so as a curious developmental specialist, she went over to check in and see if there was anything she could do to help. And what she saw was my daughter lying on the floor screaming, and my wife calmly saying, okay, tell me when you're done. Tell me when you're feeling a little better. And then kind of turning her back and ignoring her. And when they're in the meltdown, your job is to keep them safe. They're not rational. They're in a panic attack. And I think the developmental specialist was impressed that my family could back that up, not just talk about it. Your job is to not panic and to not get overly stressed. You want to show them, because they're having problems with emotional regulation, you want to show them that you've got things under control. I'm under control. You're freaking out. That's okay. Freakouts happen. But don't get overly stressed out or upset about it. And when things are all calm, then you can give them the language. And it doesn't mean it doesn't mean you want to make them apologize, but you want to give them the language that they need. So afterwards you can say, gosh, when we were in the mall, you got really upset. Why were you so upset? What was bothering you? And usually they don't know when they're 2.5 what was bothering them. But when they're 4, maybe they do know. And if they don't know, you could give them suggestions. It looks like you really wanted to buy that shirt, but remember today we weren't buying shirts. So what could you do next time when you really want something but we can't do it that day? And you're giving them the words to talk through the situation. Apologies aren't usually useful because for the most part they're mad as heck. They're in a panic attack when they're having the meltdown, so they're not really apologetic about it. It's kind of like when I see kids having meltdowns, and everybody wants to show me videos of their kids having meltdowns, and I got to tell you, I've seen, they all look the same. A meltdown is a meltdown no matter how terrible it is, no matter what they're throwing, no matter what they're breaking, no matter who they're hitting. The kids are out of control. And I use the analogy of a claustrophobic person in an elevator. If you're claustrophobic and you're in an elevator and the elevator gets stuck, you're going to climb on a pregnant lady if you have to get out of that elevator, because it's not rational in that moment. And that's what a panic attack or a meltdown for a child is like. They're not rational. So trying to talk about it and help them understand what to do in that moment often isn't successful. You wait for it to calm down, you're patient, you know it will end, and then you move on. If your child doesn't move on, well, then you got to seek professional help and see a developmental pediatrician or a psychologist who can sometimes work on you and your strategies for a child who's particularly inflexible. Let's see. I think we have time for about 2 more questions. This is a broad one. Any tips off the top of your head for dealing with preteens? Any tips off the top of your head for dealing with preteens? So the first concept I want everybody to understand is that middle school is an age where the developmental range in organized thinking is incredibly broad. So you can have a 13-year-old with the organizational skills of a 17-year-old, and they're on top of everything. And you can have a 13-year-old with the organizational skills of a 6-year-old, and that's really not uncommon. Kids that can't figure out where anything is, they do their homework with you and they forget to turn it in. They have tremendous organizational gaps. And here's the thing, every middle school teacher that I've met seems to believe that their mission is to get kids organizationally ready for high school. But the reality is that everybody's brain is developing differently. And if they had a child who was 7 years behind in math, they would be throwing every intervention possible at that child. If they were 7 years behind in reading, this child would be getting hours of reading support. But a child that is organizationally behind, people don't see it and don't understand it. And so the expectations aren't shifted to support those kids. It's really important to communicate those expectations appropriately for your preteen. And then, with the preteens, that's when they start getting a little sassy. And so don't take it personally. They'll like you again someday. Girls will start liking you again when they're about 16, and boys don't always dislike their parents. They just remain goofy till they're in their 20s. Let's see. What else do I have? One more question. What do you do if your child is anxious? Let's end with this one. What do you do if your child is anxious and perfectionistic and feels like a failure for not completing tasks or following routines? So one of the things we need to do is we need to set realistic expectations. Now, if a child truly has an anxiety disorder, if they truly have perfectionism, we need to part of therapy is helping them reshape their expectations, because it's not realistic to be perfect all the time. We're not going to win every baseball game. We're when we're pitching. People are going to get hits off of us. Our writing is not going to look perfect all the time. So if you're talking about somebody who has anxiety and perfectionism at that level, they probably need some medical help to really, or psychological help to help them deal with perfectionism. But more commonly, what we see is just mismatch in expectations. So for example, maybe it's possible we're pushing our kids a little too hard, and so we're setting these expectations and they don't want to disappoint us, and it creates this chronic frustration. We need to teach our kids that we like them for who they are and how they're doing, and we know that they're doing the best that they can. And maybe you can reshape the problem. For not completing routines, they get upset in your question. You could reshape the question and say, let's see how many times this week you can get it right, and see if next week we can get it right one more time. And so we're trying to make things move in more measurable steps. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. I'm going to hand it back to Sarah, and it was a pleasure talking to you all. Again, you can go to Raising an Organized Child, pick up the book, and read it, and we hope you enjoy it. Let us know what you think.
All right. Thank you again, Dr. Korb, for all of this information. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Korb's new book, Raising an Organized Child, you can check out his website. It's also available wherever books are sold. By registering for this webinar, you've also been entered to win one of 10 free copies, so be sure to check your email and see if you've won. If you're not selected, you can pick up the book wherever books are sold. Thanks again, and we hope to see you at the next healthychildren.org webinar.